Warning, you are leaving your safe space. Hello everyone, I'm making this video in response to the recent scandal surrounding Patreon, particularly banning Sargon of Akkad for something that had absolutely nothing to do with his Patreon account, which was actually facilitated by someone else. But I think in this debate, which Sargon's opponent, Carl Benjamin, which his opponent left during the Q&A, at the very beginning of the Q&A, the last question that he got, his response I think really sums up what the quote-unquote IDW, or some people might refer to them as the alt-right, people like Sam Harris, Jordan Peterson, Eric Weinstein, Carl Benjamin, some black guy, Dave Rubin, Joe Rogan. I think Mr. Benjamin's response here really sums up what we're after, and I think if most of the PC crowd and the SJWs really listen to the answer, that they would agree. The problem is that they want to force people to act a certain way to achieve the outcome that they want to achieve, and whenever you try to force people, it doesn't turn out well. If you think of forcing a bottle, you have a bottle full of air, say it's an empty water bottle, you put the top on it. If you squeeze it, it builds up pressure, and if you continue to squeeze it tighter, eventually something has to give. The top's going to blow off, maybe the bottle will actually blow into pieces. So we are simply saying that the method of forcing people through legislation to act a certain way is not the answer. And we need to discuss the ideas the way that Carl Benjamin and Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris discuss ideas, because we really have to get to the bottom of the problem, what the real root of the problem is, before we can come up with a sufficient solution. Everything else is just going to be a band-aid that will either fall off or be torn off. So we're just going to play this for you, and keeping in mind that this is a person that Patreon thought that they should ban. In other words, they're essentially broadcasting that they do not support this message.
What's up, Sargon? Pleasure to finally meet you in person. I was hoping to throw a bone to Thomas, but anyway. So my question to you is, this is something I actually brought up with you a few months back. Okay, so here's the issue I see here at this debate tonight. You both are speaking past one another.
Yes.
The issue is that, from my perspective, Thomas was arguing a specific definition, you're arguing a different definition. So this problem, I think, is because the MAGA movement or the iconoclast movement or the skeptic movement or whatever you want to call yourselves, you have no manifesto. You're an amoeba with no framework. Now, I've brought this up with other skeptics. However, this is my question. I pose it to you again. Does the rebel or the whatever you want to call yourselves, need a MAGA movement? Because I've looked at you guys for 10 months now. I cannot for the life of me figure out what the hell you guys want in terms of demonstrable political objectives.
Okay, well, no, that's a good question. But that's a good question. I mean, maybe someone should write a manifesto, but I don't ever want to be the kind of person who does write a manifesto. But honestly, you can just read Locke and Mill, and then you'll see exactly what I'm after. I just want people to stop being arbitrarily restrained in any way, shape, or form. I don't care how white they are. I don't care how male they are. I don't care how straight they are or not. These are not categories by which someone's liberties should be infringed. And is it really that hard to apply that? And hate speech laws. Okay, someone said something nasty on Twitter. Okay. You know, in Britain, hundreds of people a year go to jail over this. I'm telling you, never accept a hate speech law. It is the thin end of the wedge, and you'll never get rid of them. Don't do it, I promise.
Last question, 244.
Perfect. Thank you, everyone. Well, that was rousing.
I really hate speech laws. I'm sorry.
And like I said, I think that pretty much sums up what I would call them modern day centrists. You may say these are conservative ideas or liberal ideas. You know, as part of the problem, we can't actually nail down a definition of any of these terms. You know, to some people, a conservative is a racist Southern white American. To other people, a conservative is someone who thinks the government should be extremely cautious and conservative with how it conducts itself, because the way it conducts itself affects its citizens. And with this being the case, it should be conservative and not do things rashly or drastically. And so that brings us to the topic of ideology. Recently got into a little back and forth with someone on a David Pakman video that he made about Sargon of Akkad. And so it was basically, their idea was they didn't like that people like Jordan Peterson and Sargon of Akkad actually talk about ideology instead of specific policies. But I think that's really the way it should go. You know, policies come out of ideologies. You know, policies are a result of the way people think and their point of view and their perspective on the world. You know, that's how they determine what a good policy is they see the world a certain way, they think people should act a certain way, you come up with a policy that mandates it or whatever. And this, so I read their comment, replied, they replied, I replied back, and they replied back. And then when I went to give my response to their most recent reply, now for some reason I can no longer comment on that video. I don't know if I was blocked or whatever. So that's why I wanted to clarify that here, since I was unable to comment further on that particular video and keep it going. But the ideology is really what's worth discussing. You know, the whole point of the Congress is to be a battle of ideas. You know, we're supposed to bandy our ideologies around to the other members of Congress, and once we come to a significant or sufficient consensus about what a good solution is, then we make a policy. We don't go up there, each representative is basically just trying to be the one that got the most legislation passed. You know, legislation is a restriction on people's liberty, which is why the government, like I said, should be conservative and move extremely cautiously. So, on that topic, Jordan Peterson was on the Femsplainers. It's Christina Hoff Summers, and I forget the other lady's name, but they go into ideology. Specifically in this case, the question was about how ideologies affected the interviews that Jordan Peterson has been in, and I think his response really crystallizes the reason why discussing ideology should be paramount before discussing any kind of policy that we might try to implement.
Now, you have, in the press, people read that you are, you have a following of young men. And I went to hear your lecture in Washington, D.C., and there were a lot of women there. And your book, I'm first of all, men don't buy books that often compared to women, so I'm presuming you have a lot of female readers. And I found it, Danielle and I found it completely readable and...
Well, it wasn't written for men.
No, it was. So, so you have
It's more
this...
like a delusional desire on the part of the radical leftists that the only people that could possibly be attracted to me are angry men.
Exactly.
And it'd be better if they were angry young white men, you know, because
Right.
then that fits the narrative
But
completely.
you have a diverse audience, a diverse following, including many women. And
they're also not particularly angry. I mean, I've talked to 200...
You're diffusing the anger. That's the point of your book, is stop being angry, stop being resentful, right?
Well, resentment is that's absolutely crippling. Like
Right.
Resentment, deceit, arrogance. That's part of, I'm writing another book, and one of the rules is don't allow yourself to become
what is
resentful,
it again? Resentful,
deceitful, and arrogant. Yeah,
RDA.
those three
Those
things together.
yeah.
But
Boy,
it could
that
be
they're-
rad if you just...
Right. Well, that's supposed to be a good thing. So, yeah, and I mean, there's been 250,000 people, as I said, come to the lectures, and there hasn't been a single negative incident, not one.
This is what I find fascinating, is that I found you early on. I had no idea you were. I just thought it was like Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Like, who is that guy? Who is that guy? Like, you were pretty good, and we were covering a lot of the same topics later on.
yeah.
And wow! And then, you know, I found out who you were. What is astonishing to me is that there's this amazing, just split between the positivity of your audience, the diversity of your audience, the intellectual content of your message, and then you get with a snarky journalist with an agenda. And I'm not mentioning names, but this
BBC.
This young woman from GQ.
Oh, yeah.
And it
She
was
hated
just
me on site.
on site, and
So
it was
did the
just
BBC
like,
lady.
gotcha,
Yeah,
gotcha,
that was
gotcha.
Channel 4. We don't want to blame the BBC.
True.
It was
You
Channel
were
4.
a saint. And then and she seemed, you know, like as often, she seemed intelligent and capable of insight up to a point. But it's almost as if something had seized her mind, and she...
Oh, yes, something had.
Something
That's
had.
for sure. You bet.
I think people... and
Possessed
Camille
by
Paglia,
ideology.
Camille Paglia says that a whole generation of some of our most talented young women are incapable of thought because of this
Or
ideology.
different thought, maybe you mean
Or
to
just
say.
an openness to... She couldn't... And you were saying completely, like, interesting, fascinating, original things, even to me who've studied these topics. And I thought, wow. And
No, it was quite the day. So I went to Baltimore.
you survived it
Yeah,
very well
it
and
made
acquitted
me
yourself
made me think a
beautifully.
lot that day because I went there and I had to go out of my way to do it. Not that I'm complaining, but there's a reason for saying that. You know, so I got
You had to
there
go to
and
Baltimore?
yeah, well, I was talking in Baltimore.
Oh,
so,
okay.
So
There's the aquarium.
and I showed up to the hotel room where this was all occurring. And, you know, what you expect, generally speaking, even from journalists who aren't, you know, who are more of the attack dog variety or who maybe aren't positively predisposed to you ideologically or personally, you expect a certain modicum of professional politeness.
Right.
You know, because, well, you don't have to be there, and you came, and you accepted an invitation and all of that. And so even with the Channel 4 journalist, Kathy Newman, she was quite polite and forthcoming in the green room before the interview,
Right.
you know. So she would have had at least that professional persona, which is, it's not nothing, right? There's something to be said for going through the motions professionally in an appropriate manner. But when I walked into the hotel room in Baltimore, it was obvious that this interviewer had already made up her mind about me 100%, and that she was absolutely, you know, negatively predisposed to me with a personal animus. And animus is exactly the right word. And there was about a half an hour photography session because it was GQ. And so I was in that atmosphere. The photographers were fine. I was in that atmosphere for about 45 minutes before we started to talk. And part of the reason that I'm so, I'm not as calm during that interview as I usually am. I'm a little bit harsher. And the reason for that is that, you know, it just started off instantly combative. And what I should have done, you see, it's very, very difficult to be awake enough to do these things properly. And the interview progressed fine, although by the end of it, I thought that I had maybe done enough interviews for a while because I didn't think I had regulated my temper as well during that interview as I might have. I was
You actually
harsher.
did.
Well, it's
for the
not
first
so
few
bad.
minutes, you were getting angry, and then she brought up a question about anger, and I just saw you kind of adjust, and then after that, it was smooth sailing.
Well, that's good because it was touch and go, you know. And I thought, boy, you know, maybe you're running out of patience. Maybe you know, maybe it's time to dial back on the interviews because, you know, I've had many interviews like that, and they're very. I find them. Like, and it takes me like 3 days to recover from an interview.
And then
that.
you start thinking to yourself, like, what I should have said. I should have said that, and I drive myself mad. No, but you did very well. But it's so interesting that what it told me was how parochial she was, and she lives in her own little world.
But Christina, isn't it more a little bit about the ideology of our time? And gosh, you encounter this everywhere. And when I used to write about this, wisely, I would encounter it. I mean, I think part of the issue is that you will acknowledge that there are differences between the sexes. That seems to be
I know that's a hell of a
the
sexist
heresy.
thing to do.
No,
right?
that's a heresy. Because when I was reading your book, there's nothing about it that is anti-female. In fact, you do a lot of examination of the Adam and Eve story, and you have this wonderful passage about like Adam being the originally aggrieved man who throws the woman under the bus.
Yeah, no,
you know, and
He's the original.
It's her fault.
It's her
fault. And God, you too. You made her. It's your fault too that I'm hiding.
So
It's really funny.
So there's nothing in this, and the rules, such as they are, you know, they seem very commonsensical. They could apply to anyone. So is that a fair surmise of why you get so attacked? That just the very fact that you're willing to speak about the sexes as being not unequal, but
different but equal.
Yeah.
Well, you know, I would say that that's part of it because there's a threat there. So one of the things that happened when I was in Scandinavia, I just wrote a column about this actually. It was interesting being in Scandinavia, especially in Sweden, because they've pushed the equality of opportunity doctrine farther than any other country in the world.
They invented it. It all started there, like in the UN, in the original, you know, the charter. The Swedes were there. And they've never given up.
No. And the week that I was there was the same week that 2 articles were published on gender differences in temperament and in interest. And the biggest sex differences that we know of that aren't morphological are in interest. So women are more interested in people, by and large, and men are more interested in things, by and large. And the difference is actually large. It's 1 standard deviation. And so that means if you're a man, you would have to be more interested in people than 85% of men to be as interested as 50% of women. And if you're a woman, you'd have to be more interested in things than 85% of women to be as interested as the 50th percentile male. So the difference is actually quite substantial. And it's certainly large enough to drive occupational choice differences.
And
which
explains a lot about the configuration of people in the workplace.
Oh, absolutely. Well, and you know, we're approaching parity in terms of overall workplace distribution of men and women, but there's massive differences in occupational choice. Like, it's very interesting, for example, to go to the website of the U.S. Labor Department and look at male and female-dominated industries. And, you know, there's the top 10 male-dominated industries have basically 0 women in them. So bricklayers being one of them.
They're people-free zones, according to Camille Paglia. That you find just a lot of men in the people-free zones.
Yeah.
And the women you ask a group of women and men, would you rather spend the next 3 weeks taking apart a machine and putting it together, or helping a group of people work out their problems? And the pool of people who want to do the machine, it's just far more men than women.
Well, and there's more men in women-dominated industries than there are women in men-dominated industries at the extreme. So that's kind of interesting.
Would that be like nursing?
Nursing, yeah.
Yeah,
so there's way more male nurses
but
than
the
there are female
nurses,
bricklayers.
I've studied these male nurses, and they already, gender activists are upset because they earn more than women. And a professor of nursing at the University of Pennsylvania tried to find out why, and she found out they immediately find out what's the best paying field, subfield. So they go into like nurse anesthesiology. It pays a lot more. The men are there in disproportionate number, and they're willing to work insane hours. They're far more willing to move to a higher
Same thing
paying
Farrell
field.
found with gender differences, is that men are more willing to move.
Willing
They're
to
more
move,
willing
more
to
willing
work
to
longer
commute.
hours. Yeah, they're more willing to work outside. They're more willing to take on dangerous tasks. They're more likely to work in scalable industries. So like you can't scale personal care. It's really very, very difficult. They're much less likely to work part-time. If they have small businesses, they're much more likely to work full-time in the small business rather than part-time.
Yeah.
And I mean, women have their reasons to want to work part-time. And Farrell also pointed out that if you work 10% longer hours, you make 40% more money. A non-linear return on overtime. That's something that's really useful to know,
It's
in terms of your
hugely
career
beneficial
planning.
to an employer that have someone.
Well, it also
that'll
marks you out. Like if you have 10 employees and they're all doing a reasonable job, let's say, but one of them is working an extra half an hour a day or 45 minutes a day, and you can observe that every day, then that gives them an edge with regards to potential promotion. And the return on those edges is nonlinear. And so, anyway, so I went to Scandinavia, and it was the same week that 2 studies were released showing what had already been established beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the personality differences between men and women, and the differences in interest as well, actually get bigger as your society gets richer and as it gets more egalitarian. And not just a little bit either. That's the other thing that's so interesting, is you might think, well, the effect is, it's the opposite of what the social constructionists would predict, first of all. So that's the first thing to point out, is it's not only that their hypothesis wasn't supported, it was decidedly refuted. And none of them have come to terms with that. And it's not a small effect. The difference between personality between men and women in Scandinavia is a lot larger than it is in non-egalitarian countries.
And so basically what he was getting at the end there is that the Scandinavian countries adopted policies based on an ideology, thinking that these particular policies would smooth out the distribution of people among certain career paths, I guess, but it actually had the opposite effect, as men and women were free to choose the careers that they really wanted. Men stacked up on the technical side of things, dealing with gadgets, technology, computer science, the STEM fields, and women stack up on the personal care side, psychology, nursing, dentistry, just physical therapy, different fields that involve caring for people, particularly on an individual level, not just, say, in a customer service kind of role. And these are feminists, well, not feminists, but women who are agreeing with Jordan Peterson. And feminists would say that these women are not feminists, as if they don't have women's interests in mind when they're thinking through things and trying to decide how they should act in the world. And I just want to close with Jordan Peterson's closing of his 2017 Maps of Meaning course. Not only does he try to teach students to aim high, which is something I've said to people. I used to do Uber, and I picked up some college girls one night, and one of them was sitting in the passenger seat and asked me, what I was doing, and I told her some stuff I'd like to do, and she said, that's a pretty big dream, and I was like, well, if you can achieve your dreams or your goals, in your mid-20s or not long after you graduate college, then you probably were not aiming high enough. If you had aimed higher and continued working at being a better person, what then could you achieve? If you just set your bar really low and you achieve it early on, and then you just stop trying to be better, did you really achieve your goal? Is that really what you should have been after in life? And Jordan Peterson kind of says the same thing. He says, aim so high that you can't attain it. And that will give your life meaning in trying to achieve the highest goal possible. And that's why I really don't understand why Jordan Peterson gets so much flack and people want to try to shut down his message. And I think after you listen to these closing statements, I'm going to paraphrase it. He's basically telling his students that life is extremely hard, but we are human beings, and not only can we overcome the adversity and suffering that is part of existence, but we can actually make existence better, particularly for the people that come after us.
Is that I believe that the idea that lurks in these images derived from very different cultures. It's the same idea. Life is suffering. Right. Indisputable. What do you do about that? You voluntarily accept it and then strive to overcome the suffering that's a consequence of that. And you do that for you, and you do that in a way that makes it better for other people. And then that works. And one question might be, well, how well does it work? And the answer is, the only way that you can find out is by trying it. That's it. That's the existential element of it. The proof is to be derived by the incarnation of the attitude in your own life. No one can tell you how it will work for you. It's the thing that your destiny is to discover that. And you have to make the decisions to begin with. It's like, because you can't do this without commitment. You have to commit to it first. That's the act of faith that Kierkegaard was so insistent upon. You have to say, I'm going to act as if being is good. I'm going to act as if truth is the pathway to enlightenment. I'm going to act as if I should pursue the deepest meaning possible in my life. And there's reasons to do none of those. They're real reasons. So it's really a decision. But you can't find out what the consequence of the decision is unless you make the decision. I think the same thing happens when you get married, by the way. Is that if you think you might leave, you're not married. And then you think, well, the marriage didn't succeed. It's like, well, maybe you were never married. Because the rule is, you don't get to leave. And there's a reason for that rule. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't situations where there should be exceptions made for that. That's not the point. The point is that there's some games you don't get to play unless you're all in. And the other thing that's so interesting about being alive is that you're all in. No matter what you do, you're all in. This is going to kill you. So I think you might as well play the most magnificent game you can while you're waiting. Because do you have anything better to do? Really? Why not pick the best thing possible that you could do? Why not do that? Maybe you could justify your wretched existence to yourself that way. I think you could. That's what it looks like. You know, people find such meaning in the responsibilities they adopt. It stops making them ask questions about what life is for. If you have a newborn child, for example, like unless you're really in a bad way, psychotically depressed, or maybe your personality really needs some retooling, you stop thinking about anything but ensuring that that baby is doing well. And if someone comes along and asks you an existential question about your commitment to that, the right response is, why are you asking me such stupid questions when this is manifesting itself right in front of your eyes? Like, how blind can you be? That isn't a time for questions about the meaning of life. The answer is right in front of you. And if you can't see it, it's not because life has no meaning, it's because you're blind. I mean, that's what the image of the Virgin Mother and the child is all about. It's like, what's the answer to the meaning of life? Here's an answer. It's like, well, I'm going to criticize that. Well, go right ahead. You know, it's like what you're like a what do you call that? A termite gnawing on a temple. There's no utility in that sort of criticism. It's blindness. And it's the same thing with regards to the path of the hero. It's like it glistens in front of you and you can criticize it. It's like, fine. Put the cart before the horse and see how far you get. So I thought, to bring full closure to the class, I was trying to solve this terrible puzzle that confronted me and many other people about how it was that human beings got themselves in such a tangle about what they believed. Such a tangle that we were pointing the ultimate weapons of destruction at one another, which, by the way, we are still doing. And I thought, okay, well, I understand that. We need our belief systems. They orient us. And that means there will be conflict between belief systems, and that can be a catastrophe. And that's being played out everywhere, again, in very many ways. What's the solution to that? Well, one possibility is there's no solution. It's just mayhem all the way around. Could be the case. But it seemed to me, as I delved into it, that the proper solution to that was to live properly as an individual, because you're more powerful than you think. Way more powerful than you think. I mean, God only knows what you are in the final analysis. You're blind to your own weaknesses, but you're also blind to your own strengths. And so then I think, well, if you got your act together, it'd be better for you, and instantly it would be better for your family, assuming they wanted you to get your act together, and not everyone does, and then it would be better for the community. It's like, how far could you take that? If you stopped wasting time, and if you stopped lying, and if you oriented yourself to the highest possible good that you could conceive of, and you committed to that, how much good could you do? Well, I would say, why don't you find out? So that's what I think you should do. You should find out. You don't have anything better to do. And there's nothing in it, as far as I've been able to tell, there's nothing in it but good. So maybe you could sort yourself out so that you wanted nothing but the good. And then maybe you could help make that manifest in the world. And maybe we wouldn't have all these terrible problems then. At least we'd have fewer of them, and that would be a start. So it's the answer to the problem of humanity is the integrity of the individual. That's the answer. So, and states that are predicated on that realization are healthy. So, and states that aren't are doomed to stagnation and catastrophic collapse. And personalities that are predicated on self-tyranny and the tyranny of others are doomed to collapse. So, and then you think, well, what's the barrier? And the barrier is, are you willing to accept the responsibility? And part of the answer to that is, reduce the damn responsibility until it's tolerable. You don't have to fix everything at once. You could just start by fixing the things that you could fix. Or you could even do it more. You could do it with even less self-sacrifice. You could start by fixing only the things that you want to fix. God, you can get a massive way that way. So do it. See what happens. That's what you should have been taught in university right from the beginning. It's like, aim at the highest good. Tool yourself into something that can attain it. And go out there and manifest it in the world. And everything that comes your way will be a blessing.